what's special about musical-like rhythms? So I'm going to motivate you with the things that come to my mind, like you listen to music and you get the beat extremely fast. In 5 or 10 cycles, you've got the beat. The music can turn off and you can hum and replay in your mind the piece that you just listened to, even if it was only a single recording, a single listening. And once we've heard it a few times, we've got it in our mind. You can play back the song faster or slower on command. How do you do this? How is all the music that we've heard and can recall stored in our brain? Okay, is our brain filled with limit cycles, rhythm pattern generators? Are they stored as sequences? How is the timing stored? So on. Let me put my cursor here. Okay. Humans have this ability about learning rhythm and keeping rhythm, but very few other animal species do. There's a few. I want to share with you some examples. Here is Snowball, a cockatoo that has dance steps as well. Another example is this one, a sea lion.
So we train Rona to move her head in time to rhythmic sounds. And outside of humans, this ability has been seen previously only in parrots and some related birds. So Rona is actually the first non-human mammal to be shown to be able to keep a beat.
David said, my sons, yes, were part motivation for thinking about music. But the first thing that motivated me from years ago, oh my God, Bart, it was 40 years ago when you and I were together at the NIH, and we got interested in fireflies. And there are fireflies that flash periodically. And some species of these fireflies actually synchronize together. And there's a beautiful story that David Attenborough showed a video of going down a river in Southeast Asia at night. And here's part of that.
Imperfect synchrony. And the result is that even after I've drifted many yards downriver, looking back, I can still see that tree outlined with pulsing light.
To me, this was extremely impressive. And Bart and I wrote a paper on the pacemaking of these fireflies, laboratory experiments as well. But a few years later, Bart discovered those special species that can actually adapt their frequency to the forcing and hold that frequency once the forcing is removed, and wrote a nice little paper about that. And every once in a while, I kept thinking, gee, it would be nice to make another model of that, how you learn and keep a beat. So what we're going to do today is talk about the simplest kind of musical rhythm, a metronome. So I'll tell you about some of the basic properties of metronomic tracking, some modeling approaches, and I'll bring you to our biophysical beat generator approach, tell you about some of its performance. And then one part of it is, having to estimate time. So I'll tell you about the idea that Klavdia Zemlyanova, PhD student in CNS, put together a model for that. and I'll end up with some more current models and hypotheses and future goals. So this is the setup. There's a periodic brief pulsed stimulus, regularly pulsed, and the time from the beginning of one pulse to the next pulse is the inter-onset interval, the IOI. And we're imagining there's an internal representation of this pacemaker. And the idea is, in keeping the beat, is that this pacemaker will get the right period and align itself perfectly in ideal situation to that repetitive stimulus. And you can turn the stimulus off, and the internal representation will continue at the beat that it just learned. Okay, so how do we assess this in humans? Well, we might do hand clapping or typically finger tapping during experiments. So this is the part, the transient part of learning the beat, and stationary if we get locked into the beat, and then keeping the beat once the stimulus goes off. So some properties are that the range in music is on the order of 1/2 to 5 hertz. That's the typical range for music. And in a beat synchronization task, it's been shown that the sensitivity to follow that beat is lowest at around 2 hertz or so. And outside of that, the just notable difference rises at about 1/2 hertz to high levels, or at about 5 hertz to high levels. So this is sort of the limiting range for doing that. Typically, humans, non-musically trained humans, will anticipate and tap before the tone. So here you see for a short tone frequency, they're tapping maybe 20 milliseconds at a 260 millisecond IOI, and it's a larger negative mean asynchrony for slower rhythms being presented. These 4 bars here represent further kind of experiments where you might ask the subject to tap on every other cycle, or every 3rd cycle, or every 4th cycle. And in some cases, this subdivision property enables you to have more accuracy. So the accuracy for fast rhythms is better than the accuracy for slow rhythms. Here's a very nice way of doing EEG on some of these kind of experiments. Now you have the issue of, if the individual is tapping to exactly the rhythm, then you have the confound of the sensory auditory input together with the mechanical input. And how do you do EEG when it's just being, you're just recording so much of the sensory? So here's kind of a neat experiment involving imagery. So here a subject is listening to a sound that has a beat. It's a rather complex sound, but the beat is on the order of 2.4 hertz. The subject is now asked to imagine having a meter on that where you're tapping every other cycle, or you're trying to fix your mental imagery of the meter at every 3rd cycle. So the sound is only giving a spectrum on the order of 2.4 hertz, okay? 1.2 and 0.8 are down here, or 0.6 are down here. And when you listen, when you do EEG, you can pick up the mental representation of that attempt to put these sounds on a meter, even though it is not in the sound stimulus. Very nice demonstration. Okay, so first I'm going to now switch to talking about the kinds of models. So years ago, there was quite a few models. In fact, the ones we're going to be looking at were first proposed back in 1994, published in Biological Cybernetics. And you imagine there is an internal timer, and it's not set to the beat, but you have some error correction schemes that you apply to adjust, if you could, the period of that internal timer and the phase of that internal timer. And that error correction scheme applied to a simple synchronization task seems to work pretty well on paper. Other dynamical systems approaches are by Ed Large and his colleagues, where they imagine that there's an array of endogenous neural oscillators of different frequencies, and because of resonant properties, the beat picks out those oscillators that it is closest in resonance to, and they are the ones that carry the beat. Now, these are canonical oscillators. I'll tell you more about them later. They don't do timing exactly. It's more about spectral resonant properties. Another approach is by Patel and Meck, who used this on interval timing, where they had spiking oscillators with small frequency difference. And so these oscillators tended to go into a beating mode and could then represent, because of the beat period, cycle lengths which were at different lengths and maybe could correspond to the beat that you were, or the interval that you were trying to time. In our model, we're going to think of an oscillator, internal oscillator, that's adaptive. It's going to employ these error correction schemes to change the period and the phase of the internal oscillator to match the external stimulus. So it's not an entrainment model. That is, we're not forcing this internal oscillator to follow along with the beat. It probably would be delayed if we were just doing entrainment anyway. And if we stopped the stimulus, that internal endogenous oscillator would go back to doing what its natural rhythm is. But in our case, we're tuning a parameter stepwise at each of the stimulus or BG events, beat generator events, to set the rhythm and pace of this oscillator. So I'm going to tell you about it now. So this is a schematic. In is the auditory stimulus, the sound stimulus, and we imagine that there's some stimulus neurons representing that by spiking, being driven by the external stimulus. Over here is our presumptive beat generator. It could be a network. We're starting off with a simple representation, a cell, in which we have a parameter, let's call it the excitability bias, that we can tune, okay, and change the period of this internal oscillator. So this yellow box is getting input from the pulsatile stimulus. It's getting pulsatile signals from the BG. It's comparing them and then applying a learning rule for the period and a learning rule for the phase, so that these adjustments in the control parameter are made stepwise at these events. So it's event driven. This work was done together with my collaborators, Amit Bose and Anya Byrne, who was a postdoc in the lab, and you can look about it on this paper. So at the moment, our biophysics is in producing this beat generator and showing that it can adjust. And later in the second part of the talk, I'll tell you about how we measure time. You have to measure time. You have to say, what's the time of this guy? What's the time between events of this guy? How do they compare? And so there's a timing requirement to do. Okay, so here's the setup in terms of how do we estimate time? So for us, many people use the idea that there's ramping neurons in the brain and there's some threshold for the ramp, and you estimate time by how long it takes you to get to the threshold. In our case, we're going to use endogenous rhythms, fast rhythms in the brain that are ubiquitous, like gamma rhythms. So for example, on the order of 2 hertz, takes about 18 cycles of a 30 millisecond gamma cycle to represent the IOI of the stimulus. Okay, so we're counting gamma cycles, The BG is not synced at first, and it's out of phase, and its period is too long, so it has to speed up. Okay, so it's getting faster and faster and faster as we adjust the eye bias in the BG. We measure its phase relative to the external stimulus by how many gamma counts away is the BG firing compared to the stimulus firing. So we had to first develop a BG model that had a tunable parameter. And these frequencies we're looking at are on the order of delta rhythms, 2 to 4 hertz or so. And we have experience working with oscillators on that form. So we're borrowing some of the biophysics that we used in studying sleep rhythms and spindle rhythms and so on. So there's these various ionic currents in there. And this is its eye bias versus frequency relationship. And it definitely can go over the range that we're interested in. Okay, so here's the period learning rule. Okay, so if if the gamma count for the BG at each BG event is bigger than the most recent count for the stimulus, then we have to speed up the signal. So we're going to increment eye bias by a positive amount, and this is the amount by which we increment it. On the other hand, if the BG is going too fast compared to the stimulus, then we have to slow it down, and this parentheses becomes negative, okay? And you can see how that period rule would take you from going from a slow rhythm to a faster rhythm. Eye bias is incremented, incremented, incremented. These are the updates for the period rule here in purple. And after a while, it latches on more or less to the period of the external stimulus. It won't be exact because we're counting in a discrete fashion. Okay, the phase rule is activated, applied each time there's a stimulus spike. And we're asking, when there's a stimulus spike, how close to us was the most recent BG spike, and adjust the increment according to how close it was. We'd like to have a fixed point perfectly, so we'd like the phase to be either 0 or 1. So this is our made up learning rule for phase. Okay, so if it's very close to us, the previous one just ahead of us, we say, oh, it's going a little bit too early. We need to slow it down a little bit. Or if it was a long time away, we need to speed it up because it came just after the previous one. So that's the learning rule for phase. When you apply them both together, okay, and now try to synchronize going from a slow rhythm to a fast rhythm, you see that you can do this pretty well in on the order of 7 to 10 cycles with both rules operating during that time. And I want you to see that during the stationary synchronization task, both rules are still being applied because you might drift outside of that band of 1 gamma cycle wide. Okay, so the rules are applied even during the stationary state, and convergence means within a gamma cycle. So here you see during stationary activity, there may be no adjustments going on, but because you are not perfectly matched, there's a drift. Okay, there's a drift in your behavior. Oops, you've gone outside the gamma cycle, so you activate an adjustment, and then you make another adjustment and a series of, and that goes on. Okay, now does the model do negative mean asynchrony? These are the distributions of tapping times, and you can see that there's a mean that's maybe a few milliseconds in front of the tone, typically in our simulations. But that's different than what humans do on the order of 10 to 20 milliseconds for a fast rhythm, or maybe even 40 to 50 milliseconds for a slow rhythm. Yes, there's a negative mean asynchrony, but it's rather modest. And we're trying to now work on this and try to fiddle with the phase rules and so on to get a better reproduction of that in the model. Okay, so as I showed you, the model does adapt to a tempo change going from 3 Hertz to 4 Hertz, does this, and you can see how the incremental adjustments in I bias move you closer and closer from 3 Hertz up to 4 Hertz. And we can talk about the synchronization time of when the tempo switched until it more or less adapted with this blue region here. And what we found is that in studying the different transitions is that it's faster or easier to resynchronize to an increase in frequency than it is to adjust to a decrease in frequency. So Claudia did a bunch of simulations here, starting from a starting stimulus period to an ending stimulus period. So up in this upper triangle is slowing down. The colors here are that are lighter than the colors down here, indicating that generally in the upper triangle, slowing down takes more cycles in order to resynchronize. Very close to 1-to-1, you can see it's pretty general, takes a little bit slower than it does to speed up a little bit. Most of the experiments that have been done on these kind of adjustments to tempo you're beating have been done at very small increments, not like this. You can see that there's evidence for quite nonlinear behaviors yet, which we haven't quite figured out. Big changes across slight differences in target frequency shifts. So we're working on trying to figure this out. And we're going to do our own behavioral experiments soon to look at larger frequency differences that have been explored in the past and try to see where we can break the model and readjust the model. Okay, so get a drink. So we have to count, okay? We have to estimate time, we have to count. That's been ad hoc in our model, and Claudia came up with a nice scheme in order to do that. So there is a nice example of counting cycles in like tree frogs and some toads that appear to count cycles in terms of communication signals. And Andre Longtine and Richard Nutt, together with Rose at University of Utah, who was doing the experiments, have a model about that. And that was our first reference that we came to before we came up with our own scheme. Okay, so I'm gonna tell you now about our scheme, and it consists of a linear array of bistable units. And these units are Wilson-Cowan firing rate excitatory inhibitory pairs. And these are like the standard Wilson-Cowan equations. And there's going to be a parameter that sets the, there's no parameter, it's not going to be a frequency, it's just bistable unit. So the null line for the excitatory unit has the typical cubic shape, and this sigmoid shape for the inhibitory unit. This is bistable. There's a stable resting state, there's a stable excitatory state, and there's a saddle point in between. So this would be if there's no stimulus presented, you'd be sitting at a very low firing rate. And then question is, when a brief gamma cycle stimulus comes in, what happens to you? Do you get kicked up to the excited state? Well, it's going to depend on the strength of that signal, okay? So that's where the magic lies in creating a scheme that can keep track of where we are in the scheme. So we're going to make a linear array now of these units. And in this chain, the excitatory unit only feeds forward to the next pair. The inhibitory unit feeds backward to the previous pair, the one to the left. And so what we're going to do here is a successive recruitment of activity along this chain driven by the pulses from the gamma clock. Okay, so there's a pacemaker pulse is delivered to all units uniformly. So far outside those that are keeping track of the beat now, they are not going to be strong enough to kick them into the excited state. Okay, so there's going to be 3 states of a unit. There's going to be the off units. There's going to be a unit ready that's just next to a unit that's currently firing. So this guy's sitting a little depolarized enough that when the pacemaker comes in and gives it a kick, it goes into the firing state. And this guy in the firing state sends inhibition back to turn this guy off. Okay, so here we are looking at an off guy. A brief stimulus comes in, not enough to kick this guy over threshold. Okay, but if next to you is a guy that's active, you are going to be getting steady input. You're going to be sitting in the ready state. So now when a brief stimulus comes in, it's enough to kick you up into the excited state. And then you become firing and you inhibit the guy behind you. Okay, so in the macro time scale, the transitions are a ready guy goes into firing by a brief pacemaker pulse. A firing guy goes into being inhibited, and an off guy just ahead goes into the ready state. Okay, so we have, as a function of time for each stimulus, these activity pattern propagates along the chain. So here is an excited guy, a firing guy, a ready guy, okay, and an off guy. Okay, so here's an animation of that. Pulse, 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 ready, firing, and inhibited. Okay, so the situation is that the position along the train holds the count, and when the beat has come again, you reset this counter back to 0, and this was your count for that cycle of the beat stimulus. Okay, so I won't go through this. So at any one time, there's only one guy active along the cycle. So what we've done is we've translated the counting process into the spatial domain. Okay, this is almost like a line integrator being kicked one at a time, one after another. Okay, and the asymmetry enables it to go in just one direction. And we're assuming here that the unitary dynamics, the dynamics of a unit, are faster than the pacemaker period, so that the ready state is quickly set, ready for the next gamma cycle to come and kick it forward and move the system along. Okay, so this scheme is able to take time single intervals or repeated intervals. The intervals don't have to be perfectly periodic. And there we have a reset mechanism for by way of a uniform inhibitory pulse that resets the clock. The individual units then are tuned for a particular count. I meant to say here that this model is quite robust to noise. Okay, it's like in a line integrator, if you have some discreteness in the line integrator, you stabilize the line integrator. Okay, the bump. Okay, this model, we are exploring how it might be, have some of the features of interval timing. At the moment, this current formulation doesn't do scalar timing like you would like in general over a range of periods. It also has application to numerosity. It could be used in that way. Okay. Now, some other kinds of models that I can mention to you are, here's one set of models by Ed Large and his colleagues. And I want to say first of all that Ed Large has done foundational work in tracking rhythms, worked with Mary Reese Jones, published a paper on dynamic attending theory in the Psychological Reviews 20 years ago. This paper has over 1,400 citations to it. It's basically a math and theory paper that describes internal oscillations that's responsible for focusing pulses of attention energy onto expected intervals to track events with complex rhythms. So it's a way of talking about getting the beat or the underlying rhythm. Here's the essence of the current state of some of Ed Large's models. So in his models, he has now arrays of canonical oscillators. And he's got this into two arrays. One array corresponds to the sensory input, like in the auditory case. This would be oscillators along the tonotopic axis. They would have the frequency of tones that are possible in this range of focus. And then there's a motor array of oscillators. Their frequency is lower, and these are going to detect the rhythmic features, the period, and the meter of the activation of these tones that are coming in at different times. And the form of the models is rather generic. He uses canonical oscillators. So he's essentially thinking about weak coupling of oscillators that are near a Hopf bifurcation to cycle at the desired frequencies that you post. So he's got a family of canonical oscillators expanded about steady state. So you use the resonant properties of this network and you couple the network in ways that will perform a task, like generating the meter, for example, or the rhythmic structure would generate the meter. One example of Ed's work would be to capture the missing fundamental. So in a stimulus, in a complex stimulus in which you don't have in the stimulus itself any information about 2 Hertz rhythm, okay? No spectral power at 2 Hertz rhythm. The motor system can still pick out the 2 Hertz rhythm in this. So he solved a number of problems like this, and his work is referred to quite generally in the field. I want to mention a series of a couple of papers by Ani Patel, who is worked with a number of people in the field, thinking about rhythm tracking and the brain and cognition. And his hypotheses are based on a very strong linkage between the motor system, between motor areas and sensory areas. As you realize that when you're listening to music, it's just very natural to have your foot tapping or your head bobbing with the beat that you're picking up. And in fact, it's a challenge to almost sit still and let your auditory system do the job. So Ani is putting these ideas together in trying to focus on which brain areas are involved And his hypothesis is that we are generating an action simulation in our brain that is a representation of the rhythmic structure, and that this serves the auditory system as a predictive signal. And this enables you to make short-term predictions and have active sensing at the auditory level. Okay, so there's a temporally precise communication he sees between auditory regions and cortical motor planning regions, even in the absence of overt movement. Okay, so he's simulating periodic movement in motor planning regions that can provide a signal to the auditory system to predict upcoming beats. So this idea can imagine to capture the important features that he thinks about in terms of beat perception. That is, it has a predictive nature to it, and it has flexibility across a range of tempi. And we demonstrate these features as humans in sensory motor synchronization in moving to the beat. There's no evidence of these two features in non-human primates, okay? He talks about the vocal learning as a feature of humans and some other animals, non-human animals, that have this property of rhythmic synchronization, vocal learning linked to rhythmic synchronization. Some parrots, as I showed you, maybe the sea lion, seals have vocal learning apparently, and some elephants have vocal learning. What happened to my advance? Okay. Recently, just this year, Ani Patel, together with John Cannon, wrote an update to ASAP. And because ASAP was a little non-committal about how in the motor planning areas these things come together. So their current thoughts about this are put together in view of the neurophysiology and behavioral data these days that support motor planning and communication in motor planning areas with the auditory system from the supplemental motor area, and basal ganglia is also involved. So they now have proposing circuit diagrams for this. This is not a mathematical model, this is a perceptual model, but these papers are definitely worth your time and hopefully attract you to think about these things. John Cannon is developed a very nice continuous Bayesian inference model, expectancy-based rhythmic entrainment. So this is a model that is continuous in time. It's a dynamical system. It does predictive processing. It's got smacks of dynamic attendance theory, and does continuous estimation of phase and tempo. John's paper will probably be finalized before too long, and I urge you to give this a look. Another recent model, which is dynamical systems and neuromechanistic in nature, is from the lab of Mehrdad Jazieri with Seth Agar and Lee. And this is a dynamical systems model. It's got engineering-like control principles in it, but it's got differential equations, foundational in it, and there's a sensory module which gets the stimulus, and again there's a parameter, the constant current, that's provided to this neural circuit here to generate rhythmic behavior. This circuit learns the period. This circuit in the motor planning area learns the phase. So there has similarities to the way we kind of think about things. In our scheme, the two are working together. This is more of a feed-forward organization to it. But take a look. So what I've told you about is our biophysical beat generator approach, some of the things it can do. I've told you about a way to do counting for interval time estimation. In the future, where we're going to try to carry this is alternative learning rules. To be honest with you, I was a little nervous at first about just having ad hoc learning rules, even though Matt has made this work very nicely in thinking of an internal timekeeper. What it's not is straightforward LTP synaptic modification plasticity. That would be far too slow to carry out the kind of plasticity adjustments we want to make on these event-based things. So we humans do this extremely well. There are specialized learning rules that operate very rapidly. So until we know what they might be or have ideas about making them more biophysical, we're going to be playing with these kind of guys and trying to get it closer. Next step for us is thinking about more complex rhythms made up of, say, two features, loud tones and soft tones, repeating in patterns, possibly having two beat generators, one for the presentation of tones and one for the repetitive beat architecture. Another challenge is how do we replay these things? How do we make the beat generator speed up or slow down on command if it's stored? How do we store it? So those are some of the kinds of questions that I think are very interesting, and I'm happy to try to answer some questions if anybody has some.